One. One.
What gives you hope about the future of this whole thing we have going on here, human civilization?
I find it easier to be optimistic than pessimistic, because I don't know either way. So if I get to choose, why not just choose to believe it's going to pan out?
Yeah.
Like, we suffer more in our imagination than we do in reality. That's one of the quotes out of Stoicism. And I also think we have a tendency, a lot of humans have a tendency, to be pessimistic in advance for things they don't know how it's going to pan out. Climate change, for example, is making a lot of people very anxious and very pessimistic about the future. You know nothing. 40 years ago, we thought the problem was that the planet was going to be too cool. I happen to believe that it's probably correct that the planet is getting too hot and that CO2 has something to do with it. Whether we have the right measures to fix it in time, if that's even possible or not, is completely up in the air, and we don't know. If you convince yourself with such certainty that the world is going to turn to shit, it is, right up here in your head, today. Climate change might wipe out this entire species in 200 years. It's not next year. It's not 10 years from now. Your life might become more unpleasant and there might be more negative effects and so on. Yes, okay, but then deal with that hardship when it arrives. Don't take that in advance. How are you helping Earth by just walking around being depressed?
I think our whole conversation today is also an indication it's just two humans talking. There's billions of us, and there is something about us that wants to solve problems and build cool stuff.
Yes.
And so we're gonna build our way out of whatever shit we get ourselves into. This is what humans do. We create problems for ourselves and come up, figure out how to build rocket ships to get out of those problems. And sometimes the rocket ships create other problems like nuclear warheads, and then we'll, I'm sure, I hope, figure out ways how to avoid those problems. And then there'll be nanobots, and then the aliens will come, and it'll be a massive war between the nanobots and the aliens, and that will bring also all of us humans together.
The funny thing, just to pick up one of the points you mentioned, the atom bomb, for example. When that was first invented, a lot of people thought we have essentially ended life on Earth, right? Or maybe we prevented World War III from happening in the past 80 years because assured mutual annihilation kept the superpowers from attacking each other, at least head on, and kept their fighting to proxy wars. You know what? Proxy wars are not great, but they're probably better than World War III with nuclear weapons. So it's quite difficult in the moment to tell what's actually benefit and what's not. And I think we should be a bit more humble. I've certainly become more humble over time of thinking I know which way it's going to turn. I think the pandemic was a huge moment for a lot of people where there was so much certainty about whether this intervention worked or that intervention didn't work. And most people were wrong. Certainly a lot of very smart people, very qualified people got that just utterly and catastrophizingly wrong. So just a little intellectual humility. I think back upon that and go like, you know what? I'm not a PhD in virology. And I don't claim that like I somehow saw how it all was going to play out. But the people who were really experts, and they got a bunch of it wrong. Nobody knows anything. I keep reminding myself of that every day. No one knows anything. We can't predict the economy a month out. We can't predict world affairs a month out. The world is just too complicated.
Yeah, when I watched the Netflix documentary Chimp Empire and how, you know, there's a hierarchy of chimps, all of that looks eerily similar to us humans. We're recent descendants. So these experts, some of the chimps are got a PhD, others don't. Others are really muscular. Others are like beta male kind. They're sucking up to the alpha. There's a lot of interesting dynamics going on that really maps cleanly to the geopolitics of the day. They don't have nuclear weapons, but the nature of their behavior is similar to ours. So I think I think we barely know what's going on, but I do think there's like a basic will to cooperate. There's a basic compassion that underlies or just the human spirit that's there. And maybe that is just me being optimistic. But if that is indeed there, then we're going to be okay.
The capacity is certainly there. Whether we choose that capacity or not, who knows and in what situation. I think accepting that we all have the capacity for both ways, for both incredible generosity and kindness and also cruelty. I think Jung, with his whole theory of the shadow, was really spot on, that we all have that capacity in us, and accepting that it's our job to attempt to cultivate the better parts of our human nature is weighed against our propensity to sometimes be the worst of ourselves.
I'm excited to find out what's going to happen. It's so awesome to be human. I don't want to die. I kind of want to be alive for a while to see all the cool shit we do. And one of the cool things I want to see is all the software you create and all the things you tweet, all the trouble you get yourself into on Twitter. David, yeah, I'm a huge fan. Like I said, thank you for everything you've done for the world, for the millions of developers you've inspired, and one of whom is me. And thank you for this awesome conversation, brother.
Thanks so much for having me.
Traders, in this video, whether you think art
to something you don't normally see. To something you don't normally see. Called legal. You got to legal? All right. Now click on RF exposure. Now you can read it later, but it's basically telling you that you need to know that you cannot keep the phone directly next to your body without exceeding the as tested exposure guidelines. And by the way, the iPhone does it. I happen to know how to find it on the iPhone. I'm just learning the Android system myself. But all smartphones come with some information that basically says, don't keep the phone in your pocket or you will exceed the as tested exposure guidelines. Now, how many of you knew that before today? Well, this is a very well-informed audience. Now, get to setting. I like complaints, and they were in fact legitimate questions, things we did not know. There are a lot of important questions to be asked about mobile phone radiation today, without any doubt. But the reality is we're not asking those questions. And with the exception of some researchers here and elsewhere, very little new research is being done in this field. So it's a thrill to be here because Australia has been a leader in research in the field of electrical engineering and its applications to medicine, doing some of the most exciting work in the world and funded by institutions around the world, including the US Department of Defense. And I've worked at some of the top institutions in the world in science. And so when I first thought there could be something wrong with mobile phones, I actually owned 3 phones at the time. I own 2 now. And everybody has to downsize a bit. And I didn't believe there was a problem. And I thought if there were a problem, I would know about it because of course I knew all about what was important in science. Well, I was wrong. I liked the fact that I could call people or actually send them messages and expect an answer at all hours of the day, and found it kind of fun in the beginning. And when somebody said to me there could be a problem with this with our health, I said, oh, don't be ridiculous. If there was a problem, I'd know about it. Well, I was wrong. And what I now know is that information is being sent to people routinely to give them safety information. I'm going to ask you to help me out here by looking at how many of you have an iPhone. Now, I assume you didn't all turn them off. So, for those of you who have an iPhone, would you not raise your hand again? I'd like you to share with your colleagues. So please go to the settings on your phone, right? Please take a moment and nod when you've got there.
usually reminiscent.
All right. And be prepared to share. All right. Go to settings on the phone. Got there? All right. Now get to settings. Now go to about. I'm sorry, you have to go to general first. There's a mistake here.
Wash the actual body of evidence on electromagnetic radiation, and they're used the world over as proof of safety, when in fact what we know is that the staff at the World Health Organization EMF project is actually one engineer without a medical background, and she refuses to answer our questions, try as we might, simply to know who wrote the fact sheets and how they were written. What was the process by which they were written?
In 2011, the Cancer Institute of World Health Organization, with the help of 31 experts from all around the world, classified radiofrequency radiation, including mobile phone radiation, as possibly carcinogenic. And 3 weeks later, it was very strange because the World Health Organization headquarters issued a fact sheet that dismissed the cancer risks and the cancer classification.
Whilst the IARC classification covers all radio frequencies, fact sheet 193 only refers to mobile phones. This creates the impression that the classification does not apply to other uses of radio frequencies, such as masts, Wi-Fi, DECT phones, radars, and industrial uses. But the sentence, "To date, no adverse health effects have been established as being caused by mobile phone use," fails to reflect the accumulating body of evidence. This who wording is strangely reminiscent of the discourse of the manufacturers who demand the highest level of scientific evidence.
Et le fait que, the very fact that you can interpret the sentences contradictory, traiter cette phrase comme contradictoire, ça veut dire that means that it's not very clear, mais it's even a bit misleading, un peu trompeur. Alors on a demandé, so we asked the WHO in Geneva to correct that part of the fact sheet, soit corrigé dans leur fact sheet. Mais malheureusement, but unfortunately, I've checked, the sentence is still there.
This key sentence has enabled manufacturers to deliver a message downplaying the IARC classification, which actually recognizes some tentative evidence for the increase in cancers due to exposure to radio frequencies.
I wanted to know, I asked the responsible person at the World Health Organization, Emily van Deventer, who were the experts that wrote this fact sheet, this new information that was contradicting the Cancer Institute classification, and I had no answer.
Emily van Deventer is the current head of the EMF project within the World Health Organization. In June 2006, she replaced Michael Repacholi, who she had assisted since the year 2000.
So when I met Emily van Deventer in Brussels 5 months later, I confronted her with my email and I said I didn't never get any reply to my question, and I repeated my question. Who are the experts that you consulted and helped you write this fact sheet? And she still refused to answer to this very simple question. Who are the experts?
This one was just updated.
Yes, but who wrote it?
I am in charge of the fact sheet.
You wrote it?
The sentences
They're updated with
it is a corporate fact sheet. It is not my fact sheet.
Yes, but who wrote it?
Who changes the
Yes, was it you or did you consult
I
external
changed the
experts?
sentence. I consulted with a number of experts.
Who were they?
And you have to ask my administration if that is an acceptable question.
Emily van Deventer has no specialist knowledge in the field of health. She is an electrical engineer with expertise in electromagnetic fields. She is a member of the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, which originally set the international standards for public exposure to mobile phones. Emily van Deventer was a lecturer in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department of the University of Toronto in Canada. Here she carried out research financed by the telecommunications companies Bell Canada and Nortel before joining the WHO. During her public health role, Emily van Deventer remained in close contact with scientists who work for the industry. She co-wrote an article questioning the principle of precaution with some vocal defenders of the interests of electricity companies. In 2006, she joined Michael Repacholi and Peter Valberg from the product defense consultancy Gradient in signing an article supporting the theory that electromagnetic waves pose no danger to the public.
I shared with you this excerpt from the excellent film Microwave Science and Lies, which you can watch online, because there have been years of scientists and journalists asking the World Health Organization who wrote these fact sheets, which the Federal Communications Commission is actually referring to. I'm going to replay what the FCC Council states about the National Toxicology Program.
The National Toxicology Program scientists themselves said don't rely on this rat study and extrapolate to humans.
Now, I should add that on the record is extensive documentation documenting how criticisms of the National Toxicology Program are unfounded. Telecom attorney Joe Sandry filed an amicus brief in the case with a statement by Dr. Linda Birnbaum. She's the former director of the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, the former director of the National Toxicology Program. And in her statement, she states that overall, the National Toxicology Program findings demonstrate the potential for radio frequency radiation, and that's wireless radiation, to cause cancer in humans. Now, she also goes through the findings of the National Toxicology Program. You can read that in the amicus briefs. Please go to our website at ehtrust.org to download the briefs, download the amicus briefs, and read more. Now, what I'd like to point out is that the National Toxicology Program scientists, in all of their communique, have not said that this study doesn't apply to humans, but more specifically what they've said is you can't directly take the findings and apply to humans, which makes perfect sense. After all, humans are not rats. However, if something is affecting a rat or causing cancer in a rat, there are implications for human health. That's, after all, why this study was designed. In fact, the Food and Drug Administration asked for the National Toxicology Program to do this study. Now, the question is, why would the Food and Drug Administration ask for the National Toxicology Program to do a study on animals if it wasn't relevant for human health? And they actually state in their nomination of the for the NTP to do this research that they needed to look at animals because, of course, you can't experiment on people, and you wouldn't see rises in cancers and other effects for decades because of how long it takes to develop brain tumors and other cancerous tumors in people. The study also found DNA damage and a type of damage to heart tissue, and this was all at levels that were considered non-thermal. They didn't appreciably increase the heat. Now remember that the FCC is saying that heating is the only harm. Now, the National Toxicology Program study did find that the wireless exposure caused clear evidence of tumors in male rats, and those tumors were the same cell types as are found in case control studies in humans who have used cell phones for more than 10 years. If wireless radio frequency were a drug, we believe that it would be banned and pulled off the market by now because of all the reported side effects.
Second, we have aggregate limits that apply to fixed facilities. Those are set forth at 1.1307B3, and they require that all fixed facilities.
I'm talking about watches. I'm talking about iPads. Okay, those are not fixed facilities. So
sure.
And then I'm also not talking about just using a phone and holding it up to your ear. People don't use their phones, hardly use them for phone calls anymore. They're constantly in the hand, not 2 centimeters away. They're constantly in the hand, and the fingers are constantly on them. And so I'm just trying to understand how the FDA coming back and talking about cell phones that are in a holster, or nobody keeps them anymore, or are in a purse, or they're not being used? Is it all, and looking only at cancer, is it all relevant to an inquiry, again, into the effect of this radiation frequency from multiple devices that are used in entirely different ways now, an entirely different volume, and throughout the population, including children who live on iPads?
Judge Millett is speaking about the way cell phones are tested, as if they were in a holster, which of course we don't do that anymore. Remember, we used to walk around with a phone or a little clip on the belt, and there was a space between the phone and the body.
So we explained in that paragraph that exposure from mobile and portable devices tends to be a more localized exposure when they're held close to the body. That would cover things like a watch or a tablet held in the hand or a cell phone. And that exposure, because it's more localized, it tends to doesn't need to be aggregated because the whole body exposure is much more diffuse. So we addressed the fact that
and what other expert agency was the one that addressed that for you?
We were making that judgment in our own technical expertise that the effect of these emissions was not significant in the aggregate, and that therefore there didn't need to be any kind of aggregate limit. But with respect to our reliance, pardon me?
How did you decide? I mean, these things are strapped onto the arms and in the hands significant part of the day. How was it that you decided that that was not a significant change from what you had looked at in 1996?
Well, there are no substantial adverse effects from exposures at the existing levels. So the fact that they're strapped on the wrist.
And how did you find that? Was this for your 2.5 centimeter test?
Well, no. What I'm doing is referring to our explanation of why the existing limits continue to be sufficient.
When she talks about how phones are constantly in the hand and not centimeters away, what she's talking about is how, I believe, something that we raised in our brief, which is that the way phones are tested at a distance from a body dummy do not reflect the way that we use devices, because of course people carry phones in their pockets, touching their body, in their jeans pockets, in their bra, in their tight spandex pants. Babies are handed cell phones as toys. You're basically hugging them. We have virtual assistants that they have near their beds. Their heads are near them. Teenagers are on their phones 24 hours a day. For teenagers, a cell phone may as well be an appendage. I mean, it's like another hand they have. They could never put it down. Newborns are exposed to cell phones because the parents are using cell phones constantly. And of course, this is not just about cell phones, but about Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and the wireless devices, the billions of devices that make up the wireless Internet of Things being marketed to us nonstop. And it saturated our lives, every inch of our life, day and night, and every age group, from pregnancy to babies, toddlers, kids, teenagers, adults, and the elderly. There has been no review by any U.S. health and safety agency that has looked at all of the research.
We formally solicited the views of other entities with expertise in this area. We made very clear that we wanted to rely on them. We relied on the views of expert agencies in adopting these limits in the first place, and no federal agency or body. Did you solicit these committees, or did you just solicit the FDA? We in at JA 165 of the notice of inquiry, we said we formally seek the input of all of the expert bodies in this area, and we left the docket open for 7 years, giving ample opportunity to weigh in, and not one of these bodies said you need to change your standards. And we're not arguing that silence should be construed as endorsement, but it shouldn't be construed as disapproval of the agency's existing limits. I think even if you construe it as neutral, all of the representations that we did receive, and again, the FDA it's undisputed that
you
the
want
FDA
us to construe as deliberation, that silence should be construed as these relevance committees actually deliberated, actually reviewed the record and studies. So you are asking us to infer something that's significant.
Well, all that we're asking you to infer is what the Second Circuit and Cellular Phone Task Force said was reasonable, which was for us to presume that the agencies and bodies charged with staying on top of this area and regulating in this area and paying attention to the science in this area have done so. And yes, we're asking that you presume that the agencies with responsibility in this area,
even when the report that they send back doesn't reference, lots of relevant studies and lots of relevant issues, we still presume that they reviewed those studies and those issues.
Yes, I think it's reasonable for the FCC to presume that they did. As I said, the FDA referred to its ongoing monitoring activities and confirmed its responsibility in this area. And I don't think that there's any requirement that the FCC wait for this committee to speak as a committee, that it can't rely on the FDA's representations about the state of the science. Again, this committee is created in the FDA's operating statute and appears in the section right after FDA has been anointed the agency with responsibility in this area. And I think under the
you can't tell me whether that committee even exists or whether the committee reviewed anything having to do with this petition.
I can't, sitting here. I don't have any personal knowledge about that committee. I do know, as I said.
Why shouldn't that bother the court?
Well, again, because the FDA weighed in. It's statutorily directed to be the responsible agency in this area. And I think the FDA, we know it does have primary jurisdiction over public health. I don't know that every other member of that committee does, but they are certainly well equipped to evaluate the science and make a representation about the sufficiency of the radio frequency emission limits. I mean, one other point, the FDA regulates in this area. They are responsible for promulgating the radio frequency emission levels for devices that the FCC doesn't regulate. So again, this is an important part of their mandate. And just as we relied on expert agencies in adopting the limits, it was reasonable to do so here. Just one more point on this. As I said at the outset, we weren't writing on a blank slate here. In 1996, we adopted these limits and we had the input of the FDA, the EPA, OSHA, and IOSH. So these limits don't reflect the views exclusively of the FDA. It was a considered and lengthy deliberative rulemaking, and none of them weighed in to say that they needed to be changed.
And we document in our brief that actually sister agencies are not in agreement about keeping FCC limits. We have a letter from the EPA, we have information from the National Cancer Institute, where they say that they don't even make safety determinations. And we have a letter from the Department of Interior pointing out research showing impacts to birds. The judges really queried, why was the FCC making each statement that they made? And here's a clip where the judge asked, who are you citing? How did you make that determination?
Well, I think that there's nothing in the statute that suggests that the committee has to speak through the committee. I think that the FDA, as the agency charged with keeping abreast of the science in this area, can speak to the state of the science, and it does refer to its ongoing monitoring activities in its letter to the FCC at J8187. And this is extra record material, and we're not relying on it for you to uphold the agency's decision, but the FDA did release a review of the scientific evidence in 2020, and its conclusions were consistent with the conclusions that the FCC drew.
We can't consider that.
No, we're not.
We can't consider that.
That's absolutely right, and we're not suggesting that you need to consider it to uphold the agency's decision, but I think it does confirm the centrality of the FDA to this area.
The FDA, it's not just that we don't know that they asked their experts, we don't know what they asked them, because all we got from the FDA is cell phones and cancer. We know whether, is it reasonable for the FCC to take the FDA's representations at face value without verifying that the relevant experts have looked at the questions that the FCC actually asked when they get a report back that only talks about cell phones and cancer?
I think it is reasonable for the agency to do so, and I think that's what the court and Cellular Phone Task Force said.
No, it didn't have, in our case, we specifically noted that what could make a difference is if circumstances change. We have that in, and that circumstances could change over time, then there would need to be another look. And that was what you all flagged in your notice of inquiry was things have changed, including the ubiquity and multiplicity of devices.
These oral arguments really call out what's happening, not just in the United States, but all around the world, where when this issue is raised, people are told there is no evidence of harm. We repeatedly hear in the news media and by politicians that there is no evidence of any effects of harm from radio frequency radiation wireless, be it from cell phones, Wi-Fi, cell towers, and all these wireless devices that are coming out now with 5G and the Internet of Things. We are told there is no evidence. But what is that based on? Who has made that determination? And the judges in this case really got to the heart of the issue. They wanted to know, how did you make that statement? They asked the FCC, how did you come to the determination that there is no evidence of any effects, especially when it comes to cumulative effects from long-term exposure to hours and hours of low-level exposure to radio frequency radiation? The judges clearly read the briefs because they point out that the FDA is only talking about cell phones. The FDA is not dealing with cell towers or all kinds of wireless devices and networks that we have in our lives today. I mean, what about smart cars? The FDA doesn't deal with smart cars and all the technology in cars, or smart meters, which are rapidly being put on homes across the nation for energy, as well as gas and other utilities. Our case is not just about cell phones. It is about wireless radio frequency radiation, which comes from numerous sources. Now, in this clip, the issue of the 50 times safety factor is raised. We address this extensively in our brief. There is no 50 times safety factor for several reasons. First, even if there were a 50 times safety factor, a factor of what? The basis for our limits is about thermal heating. So even if that were the only harm, even if heating were the only harm, making a 50 times safety factor from a level set to protect against heating doesn't protect us, because our entire case is about the fact that there is an extensive record of research showing impacts that are non-thermal, that are at very low levels of radio frequency radiation. And you can listen to the judge query the FCC counsel on this in this clip.
And what we know is that at 4 watts per kilogram, we start to observe thermal changes. There are no substantiated adverse effects below that level. And as it is, our standards incorporate a substantial safety margin. They're 50 times safer than that 4 watts per kilogram.
We're looking for thermal effects, but not looking for non-thermal effects, right?
We're not, the limits address both kinds of effects, because the only substantiated adverse effects are thermal ones. And we acknowledged evidence on the other side. We acknowledged that much of the record was not scientific. That which purported to constitute research evidence lacked any persuasive case as to its value or significance. We acknowledged 3 of the 4 major studies that petitioners rely on in their brief, and explained why they didn't provide any basis to reevaluate our limits. And again, going back to
towards the end of oral argument, Judge Henderson requested that the FCC provide documentation on the Technical Electrical Committee of the FDA, as well as the Radio Frequency Interagency Work Group.
I'd be happy to answer other questions of the panel.
I do have one. How difficult would it be to determine whether these committees and working groups exist?
I could easily.
Well, I mean, are they set up by regulation, or that's my question. Is it a question you can answer with some sort of supplemental submission?
Yes. It is a factual question, and it's certainly one that we can answer in a supplement if the panel is interested.
Ms. Boiselle, can you get whatever information there is about the formation of these committees and working groups we've been talking about, and submit it? Let's say that should be fairly easy. It's either there or they either exist or they don't. Let's say by 5 o'clock tomorrow, and then Mr. McCulloch, let's see. I don't know that there'd be anything to respond to because they either exist or they don't, but why don't you take another 24 hours if you have anything you want to submit in response?
On January 26th, the FCC submitted to the court a response to Judge Henderson's request. In their response, they document that the Electronics Committee consists of 15 members who have not met since 2016, and that there are 10 current vacancies on that committee. In addition to factual information, the FCC response actually adds an argument in their latest response. For example, they say that no statute or regulation required them to seek out the views of the technical committee. Regarding the radio frequency radiation work group, the FCC attaches a charter indicating that representatives from the FDA, FCC, Environmental Protection Agency, National Cancer Institute, National Institute on Occupational Safety and Health, National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and Occupational Safety and Health Administration are involved, at least according to the charter dated 2012. I need to add here that recently I had an email exchange with the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, and I specifically asked about the radio frequency interagency work group. On July 8th, 2020, I received a response from Lee Ann B. Veal, the director of the Radiation Protection Division at the Environmental Protection Agency. I specifically asked who the staff member of the Environmental Protection Agency was on this work group. The response I received from the Environmental Protection Agency in 2020 was, the Radio Frequency Interagency Work Group is an informal forum for exchange of information, and the group does not meet to set or advise on policy, rulemaking, or guidance. The group has not met in more than 2 years. And when I asked about what U.S. agency has reviewed the research on damage to trees or damage to memory or impacts on birds and bees, we received the same response. And that was that the Environmental Protection Agency does not have a funded mandate for radio frequency matters, and that they are not aware of any EPA reviews that have been conducted on the topic of trees as well as birds and bees. And the EPA also said that their last review related to impacts to human biology was in 1984. The FCC submission also says that, as the court has recognized, the views of the work group do not represent the official policy or position of member agencies. In response to the FCC, Environmental Health Trust and petitioners submitted on January 27th a document which we have posted on our website at ehtrust.org, along with all of the other documents discussed in this case. We actually contend that the FCC's January 26th letter exceeds the scope of the information requested by the court at oral argument. We and petitioners asked the court to disregard all of the arguments in Section 1 of the FCC's letter in its entirety. The last sentence of our submission, which again is online at ehtrust.org, states, the FDA and Dr. Sherm were free to ask for input from this committee, referring to the Technical Electronic Product Radiation Safety Standards Committee, but apparently did not do so. We cannot thank you enough for your support of our historic case against the Federal Communications Commission. We have an excellent legal team well versed in the issue of the Administrative Procedures Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, which are two key laws that we are addressing in our lawsuit. And they have put in a tremendous effort, and they have gone above and beyond in this case. Please stay in touch. Make sure that you're signed up for our newsletter at ehtrust.org. If you want to know what we're up to, please join us. Thank you.
Did you know that cell phone, the one in your pocket, emits radio frequency radiation, as long as your phone's turned on, even if you're not talking or texting?
The American Academy of Pediatrics in over a dozen countries recommends reducing children's exposure to wireless radiation.
When using a cell phone, I always keep it away from my body. I use speakerphone or a headset like this.
To stop microwave exposure, I put my phone on airplane mode and turn off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth function.
I hold the phone at a distance and make sure it's not touching my body.
Cell phones are not toys. Children's brains and bodies are still developing and are vulnerable to wireless radiation. Practice safe and responsible habits with yourself and your children. When using the computer, I always try to make sure my connection is corded, not wireless. Remember not to use your cell phone in the car. The phone works at higher power in metal surroundings and bounces around, increasing your family's radiation exposure.
For their safety.
For your safety.
Because children are more vulnerable.
Remind them. Remind yourself.
To limit your microwave radiation exposures.
I think that was pretty good. Wait, there's more.
Internal memo from Motorola.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, with this web exclusive. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to part 2 of our look at a new investigation by The Nation headlined "How Big Wireless Made Us Think That Cell Phones Are Safe." It reveals how cell phones were first marketed to U.S. consumers in the 1980s without any government safety testing. Then, a decade later, one of the industry's own hand-picked researchers, George Carlo, reportedly told top company officials, including leaders of Apple, AT&T, and Motorola, that some industry commission studies raised serious questions about cell phone safety. On October 7th, 1999, Carlos sent letters to industry CEOs urging them to give consumers, quote, the information they need to make an informed judgment about how much of this unknown risk they wish to assume. Instead, the Cellular Telecommunications and Internet Association reportedly tried to discredit Carlos' findings and had him physically removed from its premises during its annual conference in February 2000.
The Nation investigation notes Carlos' story evokes eerie parallels with two of the most notorious cases of corporate deception on record, the campaigns by the tobacco and fossil fuel industries to obscure the dangers of smoking and climate change, respectively. For more, we continue with our interview with one of the authors of the new investigation, Mark Hertsgaard, the Nation's environment correspondent and investigative editor. So, Mark Hertsgaard, if you could reiterate, at this point in 2018, as you evaluate the science or talk to the scientists who are evaluating it, what do you think is of most concern about cell phones? And then talk about ways to mitigate the effects of cell phones.
Sure. I want to emphasize I'm not a scientist. I'm a journalist and an author, but we talk to a lot of scientists. And our story does not say whether cell phones are safe or not. We looked at the industry disinformation and propaganda campaign that for the past 25 years has been convincing the public that these cell phones are safe. And the way they've done that is to war game the science, as they put it in an internal memo from Motorola. They've funded their friendly scientists. They've attacked critical science, independent science. They've put their own people onto advisory boards. All that said, that's resulted in, I think, the message coming across from the mainstream media, frankly, that cell phones are safe enough, shall we say. However, that point of view took a major hit just last week. The night before we released our story, there was a peer review by independent scientists of the biggest study that the United States government has had to date on cell phone radiation. This was a study by the U.S. National Toxicology Program, that's part of the National Institutes of Health. The study was commissioned by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and released some preliminary findings in February And then those findings were peer reviewed by independent scientists last week. And those independent scientists finally concluded that there was, quote, clear evidence, unquote, clear evidence that cell phone radiation can cause cancers. And notably, those independent scientists upgraded the confidence level of that and other findings by this National Toxicology Program. So what that seemed to do was to confirm the suspicions by outsiders that the National Toxicology Program brass, the people up at the top, were trying to downplay this study because it was the very same data that had been released in 2016. And when that data was released in 2016, it came with a public health warning by the National Toxicology Program. And in 2018, back in February, they tried to downplay this. So it's very significant that last week, these independent scientists said, oh no, there is clear evidence here that cell phones can cause cancer. Now, before you all worry out there that you're having the equivalent of a cigarette habit, let me just say that the evidence is not yet definitive of how high the risk is for cancer, and genetic damage is another concern here. But it is definitely, it seems, a risk. If you look at the scientific data that is compiled by the National Institutes of Health, the actual studies that they catalog there, the vast majority of them do indicate that there are health impacts of this technology, of this radiation, I should say, according to Henry Lai, a professor at the University of Washington, who's analyzed all of this, and we talked with him in some detail. So there are things you can do. The main thing you can do as a consumer is to minimize your use of your cell phone. Use a landline telephone whenever you can. And if you must use a cell phone, always use earbuds and use it for as little time as possible. Don't go on and on. Have your phone call and complete it. And in general, you want to try and minimize the risk. Again, I am not a pediatrician. I'm not a doctor here. You can talk to organizations like the American Pediatrics Association, which, by the way, told the Federal Communications Commission 5 years ago that they needed to revisit this question because their standards weren't adequate. The FCC has not done that, but you can talk to them. You can talk to a group called the Environment Health Trust, and they will give you more information on this.
That's really interesting that you talk about the FCC, and they haven't done that because the former head of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was Tom Wheeler. In 1999, then the president of the Cellular Telecommunications and Internet Association, Thomas Wheeler, spoke to ABC News 2020. And listen carefully.
I believe that the cellular phone is safe. Our industry has gone out and aggressively asked the question, can we find a problem? And the answer that has come back is that there is nothing that has come up in the research that suggests that there is a linkage between the use of the wireless phone and health effects.
So that was, yes, Thomas Wheeler, who was President Obama's pick as FCC chair, speaking to Brian Ross on ABC. Mark Hertzgaard, can you talk about his role?
And that was a lie. That was a lie that Mr. Wheeler told. We spoke with Mr. Wheeler for this story. He gave us an interview, but insisted on putting it off the record, except for one statement that said that he followed the recommendations of the Food and Drug Administration, which had found no dangers from health phones. But what he told Brian Ross in that story, that they went out and aggressively questioned the science, was their problem, that part was true. But to say that they found no such evidence, that was an absolute lie. And I use the word lie deliberately. He knew perfectly well by that time that he had been told by George Carlo, the scientist, that there were serious questions from their own $28.5 million research program. And so to me, the career of Tom Wheeler is an interesting illustration of a very old story in Washington, D.C. about how the regulatory agencies of the federal government get captured by the very industries that they are supposed to regulate. So Wheeler left the industry and later went on to head the FCC for President Obama. And in the meantime, it's gone the other way around. The FCC person, vice president at the FCC, I guess, or vice chair rather, Baker, came to now runs the Trade Association. And this is why the Harvard study on this by Norm Alster calls the FCC a captured agency. They have been captured by the industry they're supposed to regulate. And the single best example of that I can give you is the FCC does not even independently test the radiation levels on these phones. They take what the industry claims and just put it on their website. That is not good enough. Part of the reason that we're down this road all the way we are up so far is that we did not test cell phones back in the 1980s before they went on the consumer market. And we're about to make that same mistake again with 5G technology.
Well, can you explain what 5G technology is?
Sure. 5G means fifth generation, and that's the next generation of the technologies that have been used for cell phones and wireless going back into the 1990s. And where people might have heard of it most is 5G technology is what will be required if we go to this thing called the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is the idea of your smartphone being connected to your smart car and your smart household so that all of your appliances, your cell phones, your computers, everything will be connected 24/7 so that you can, while you're driving home, you can turn on the oven 25 minutes from home so that it's nice and warm and you can make your dinner when you get home. That seems like it's a kind of a convenient idea perhaps, but when we did the reporting on this, my colleague Mark Dowie went to the conference of the industry and saw, and we have this picture in the Nation magazine story, saw a picture of a baby, a doll, wearing a diaper, and at the crotch of the diaper is a little transmitter. So this transmitter, under the 5G technology, Internet of Things, this transmitter will send a little message to mom or dad in the next room that, oh, the baby's diaper needs changing. Well, do we really need that? And do we really want to have radiation going from our baby's crotch to our cell phones? Why don't we just walk into the next room and check for ourselves?
In January 1993, David Reynard of Tampa, Florida, sued the NEC America company. Speaking on national TV, Reynard said his wife's NEC phone caused her lethal brain tumor. Let's go to a clip from ABC News' 2020 investigation that aired in 1999 that begins with Reynard.
Tumor was exactly in the pattern of the antenna.
David Reynard went on to almost single-handedly create a national scare when he filed a lawsuit and went public with his allegations.
Well, we're suing the carrier, we're suing the manufacturer.
There was great alarm on Wall Street, and even though Reynard's lawsuit was later thrown out by a judge for a lack of reliable scientific evidence, it left the cell phone industry with a huge public relations problem.
So, Mark, could you comment on that? And also the distinction, if there is any, in terms of possible risks of using a cell phone to talk as against using it for email or for texting? Is there a difference from what you've learned about possible risks?
That's really where the industry, wireless industry's propaganda campaign was launched. Because as Brian Ross's report just showed, they had a huge public relations problem at that point. There were congressional subcommittees beginning to investigate. The stock on Wall Street was tanking. And that's when Tom Wheeler stepped up and immediately told a hastily gathered press conference, cell phones are safe, but we're gonna revalidate that with this new science. And that was how they then found George Carlo, the scientist who they hired to do that. And it's interesting, George Carlo, I wouldn't call him a whistleblower exactly, but he certainly did not work out the way that the industry had hoped. They had hired him because he seemed like, by his own acknowledgement in our interviews with him, he seemed like an industry guy. And they thought that because he had previously done studies in which he said dioxin was not terribly harmful in small quantities. Dioxin, of course, was behind the Love Canal and the Agent Orange scandals, one of the most toxic chemicals on earth. He had also said that breast implants were not necessarily dangerous. So George Carlo seemed like the kind of guy who would return a friendly verdict for the industry, and then he did not. And that is really where their ways parted. And Carlo eventually told the truth wrote to Brian Ross and to us, and in a book, Cell Phone Radiation, if you listeners want to check that out. Now, to your question, Amin, about the differences, again, I'm not a scientist here. I'm a little uncomfortable talking about that. There are plenty of places where you can go to get good information on this. I'd recommend the National Environment Trust is one. The American Pediatrics Association has also raised concerns about this. However, I do know this from sources that we've interviewed on this story, that you want to always wear earbuds if you're going to use a phone. You want to minimize your use of the phone. And yes, texting is better than a phone call in terms of the amount of radiation you're exposed to. And also, the moment of the connection of the call is when there is the biggest surge of radiation. That is, after you've dialed, you hear it ringing, and then it connects to the other phone. That at that moment, hold that phone away from you. The farther away it is from your skull, the less radiation that is going to be touching you. But again, the main thing is to just limit your use of all of this to the maximum extent that you can. Use landlines when you can. You know, the world still spun on its axis. We all had our lives before there were cell phones. You can do it, folks.
I wanted to ask you about the criticism of your piece. Dr. David Gorski, a surgical oncologist at Barbara Ann Karmanos Cancer Institute, wrote a piece for his blog, Science-Based Medicine, criticizing your report. His post is headlined, "The Nation Indulges in Fear-Mongering About Cell Phones and Cancer." In it, Dr. Gorski writes, an article published last week in The Nation likens wireless telephone companies to tobacco and fossil fuel episodes in their tactics of spreading fear, misinformation, and doubt regarding the science of cell phone radiation and health. To produce this narrative, the investigation's authors rely on unreliable sources and cherry-pick scientific studies, ignoring the scientific consensus that cell phone radiation almost certainly doesn't cause cancer, all the while disingenuously claiming that they aren't taking a position on the health effects of radio waves. And Dr. Gorski continues, the idea that the radio frequency electromagnetic radiation used by cell phones and wireless networks is somehow causing horrendous health effects in humans, be it cancer, brain, breast, or other, behavioral problems, mental illness, or whatever, is like anti-vaccine pseudoscience, a claim not supported by evidence that just will not go away, says Dr. Gorski. Your response to that, Mark Hertzgaard?
Thank you, Dr. Gorski, for providing such a illuminating illustration of the very kind of disinformation campaign we're talking about here. We're not scientists, but maybe he would revisit his blog post if he looked at what the peer review of independent credentialed scientists just said last week about the National Toxicology Program's finding. They said, quote unquote, clear evidence that cell phone radiation causes cancer. We are not cherry picking. That is exactly what the biggest study ever funded by the United States government has said about this. And it was not what the government agency was trying to say. The government agency was trying to retreat from that position, and it's only because of peer-reviewed scientists on the outside that we know that. Go back and read our piece and compare it to the good doctor's blog. I'm very confident that our reporting stands up.
Well, Mark, I know you have to take your daughter Kiara to school. Congratulations on her 13th birthday.
I think we covered everything. Wait, there's just one more. If you get a chance, check out the documentary Generation Z.
When you put adaptation into the equation, now it's even more complicated because the signals don't affect everybody the same way.
I'm here in Brussels to attend a conference on electrical hypersensitivity and multiple chemical sensitivity. And the reason that we're holding this conference is because there are so many people suffering from environmental illness, and it's important to get the scientific community together with the medical community so that we can help people recover from electrical hypersensitivity.
My background is as a neuroscientist. I've studied the central and peripheral nervous system. We have struggled for many years to get some form of answer to the simple question: a person with electro hypersensitivity, what is he or she?
This Congress is trying to raise awareness among healthcare practitioners because so few of them recognize environmental sensitivities, and very often people are misdiagnosed as having psychological problems rather than physiological responses to environmental stressors.
If I ask you how much more such radiation does penetrate your body today compared to like 10 years ago, is it twice as much? 3 times as much? No, it's a quintillion times more. That's a 1 with 18 zeros.
With Asana, AIT.
What we would call a regulatory paradigm.
Ordinarily, in a regulatory context, new technologies would be tested extensively before they reach the marketplace in order to make sure that they didn't present any dangers to consumers. In the case of cell phones and the wireless industry as a whole, this crucial stage was bypassed. This meant the regulatory agencies were forced to rely on post-market surveillance.
There was an argument going on between the EPA and the FDA, and the FCC was in the middle of it, about the safety standards that should be put in place for analog phones. And that standard was the specific absorption rate.
SAR, or specific absorption rate, is a measure of the rate to which energy is absorbed by the body when exposed to cell phone radiation. The smaller the body, the greater the exposed area.
But the standard was based on microwave oven studies from the 70s and 80s, was really not relevant to anything other than heating effects.
When they did some safety testing, the device that's had the most testing is probably the mobile phone. It's one of the first devices that emits this kind of radiation. And they built a model that they called SAM, standing for Standard Anthropomorphic Mannequin. But bizarrely, what they did was SAM was based on the 90th centile of military recruits. So he wasn't representative of a child or even a woman or actually an average man. This guy, just his head weighed 5 kilograms, which is more than some children's entire body.
I think the thing that surprised me most and really kind of caught my attention the most, which I hadn't realized, is that the manufacturers actually tell people in the instruction manual, which I never read, not to put the cell phone against your ear.
The advice in the phone tells you to keep it off the body because phones are tested in 2 positions. They are tested next to the head and next to the body. When they're tested next to the head, they're tested with a spacer. It used to be 10 millimeters away from the head. Now I think it's 6, but the point is there's a space between the phone and the head. The industry has succeeded in getting the FCC to accept an approach where the phone is not used like this. And you know that this is exactly how most people use phones.
In that time frame, in 1995, 1996, it was really the industry that was pushing for the SAR standard. And the reason was because they knew that they could easily meet the SAR standard. If you got into standards that were biologically based, actually looking at health effects and all that stuff, the industry was worried. We do have one finding in experiments that indicates the potential for genetic damage coming from radio frequency radiation, such as that comes from phones. And we also have an epidemiological finding of an increased risk of a very rare type of brain tumor among people who report using cellular phones. We were sort of caught in a difficult place because some of the claims that were being made about health effects were so severe that had there been pre-market testing, cell phones never would have made it into the marketplace. So what happened was, through some lobbying efforts and in the Telecommunication Act when it was finally passed, the EPA's RF program was defunded. We didn't like what they were saying, so let's get rid of it. And that's what happened.
People deserve to have the right to know. The industry wants to keep the cat in the bag as long as they possibly can, that there is harm. They don't like the word radiation. They don't like the word safety. They're against all of this because they don't want to alarm people. And the big thing is they have no liability insurance. By Lloyd's of London or Swiss Re, the two top insurance companies. The main effect on the insurance industry will concern product liability claims for bodily injury. I'm involved in this issue because I love my husband. Just a few months after Alan had his diagnosis of a brain tumor, I ended up testifying to the United States Congress about it.
Today's hearing will examine what science is saying about the potential links between long-term use of cell phones and tumors or other health effects.
I see this from the public health perspective as being very, very important that we urgently need more research. We have almost no U.S. funded research in this area.
I'm not a scientist. I'm a human being, a mother, a wife. I do know from my research and from talking with doctors and scientists worldwide that there are major flaws, even in this interphone study. I have in front of me something right here that says the interphone studies always find a statistical significant elevated risk when a cell phone has been used for 10 or more years on the same side of the head where the tumor was found. I'm sorry, but I'm not understanding the lack of correlation here. The FCC is debating the science, and the FCC is a captured agency. They're captured by the telecom industry. There's a revolving door between the telecom industry and the FCC. There's people that have worked at the FCC that now work for the telecom industry. There's people that work for the telecom industry that are now at the FCC.
When I myself look at where people go for advice, so where would I go as both a parent and a medical doctor? I look at the World Health Organization, I look at my government and the education authorities and the groups like the Department of Health. And it's very hard now to find groups who are truly independent. All of these groups receive revenue from the telecommunications industry.
The wireless industry spends $100 billion a year lobbying the Congress. They have very good access to the FCC, so it's really hard to go up against the power of this industry, even when you have the facts on your side.
Despite the industry attempts to suppress the findings of the scientific community, scientists continue their pioneering research into the adverse effects from EMF and RF exposures.
That wasn't too bad now, was it? What are we looking at, an hour? That's almost like a movie, right? Well, I hope we got a summary of, you know, the big picture. A highly intelligent woman that thought that there was no problems with cell phones. +200 scientists have signed the international call to action on non-ionizing radiation. Over Environmental Health Trust, in 7 minutes, a radiologist specialist describes the frequencies, and everybody usually claims, well, those frequencies are non-ionizing, so they're not harmful. That's an inaccurate statement. we're here, I might as well grab the video.
Thank you, Chairman. Members of the committee, good evening. I'm here to explain in 7 minutes how radiation from cell phones and cell phone towers, like all forms of electromagnetic radiation, penetrate into the body, may damage cells, and potentially cause disease. But first, let me preface my talk by stating that I'm a practicing board-certified diagnostic radiologist, who, like all radiologists, trained in radiation physics. I spend my days interpreting the images created by exposing the human body to different forms of radiation. In healthcare, radiation can be used to treat and diagnose disease like cancer, but it can also cause disease and is therefore tightly regulated. Following are some pictures and videos I'd like to present to make a point. This is a chest X-ray. We are able to obtain this image because X-rays produced by an X-ray machine penetrate through the patient's chest and expose a plate on the opposite side of the body. X-rays are a form of electromagnetic radiation. In this image, you can see the finger glowing red when it is placed on a bright light. This is because light, like X-rays, can penetrate through the body's tissues. Light is a form of electromagnetic radiation. By placing a body in a strong magnetic field and subjecting it to pulses of radiofrequency radiation, we were able to get images like this one from an MRI of the shoulder. This technology is possible because both magnetic fields and radiofrequency radiation, just like light and X-rays, penetrate through the body and affect atoms and molecules. Now, this graphic depicts the continuum of frequencies that comprise the electromagnetic spectrum, and I placed the 3 images in the respective frequency bands. Microwaves and millimeter waves produced by the 5G network are demarcated by this sun. These frequencies also penetrate into the body. As you know, there are 3 bandwidths of frequency in the 5G network. The highest frequency band includes frequencies between 20 and 40 gigahertz. A meter recently became available to the public for the high frequency band detection. I'm going to show you a couple of brief videos demonstrating the use of this detector. I took these videos with my cell phone in airplane mode, and there were no other sources of 5G radiation and no Wi-Fi in the house. Now, if you look at this first video, which was taken in an interior room, you'll see the green indicator light is on, and the display reads less than 5 microwatts per meter squared. This is background. In this next video, you can see outside the front door of this home, there is a pole-mounted 5G small cell across the street. If I take out the detector and I turn on the volume, you can see that the radiation emitted from this small cell is erratic but continuous. The maximum tower density coming from the antenna on this front stoop is over 10,000 microwatt per meter squared. In this final video, you see radiation exposure one would receive in a 3rd floor bedroom with the window closed while lying on the bed. You can still hear the detector is picking up radiation, and while lying in bed, the person is still receiving a dose or power density of over 700 microwatts per meter squared. All forms of electromagnetic radiation penetrate the body. Some frequencies penetrate deeper than others. Unfortunately for all of us, and I do mean all of us, government regulations are still based on research performed by Hermann Schwann, a distinguished scientist who in 1953 said that heating effects should be used to determine safety limits for microwave radiation. I remember my father telling me when he was in college in 1953, He had heard over the cafeteria loudspeaker that Watson and Crick had discovered DNA. Yes, we've learned a lot since 1953. One of those things is that non-thermal effects occur in the body from non-ionizing radiation. Scientific studies have repeatedly shown that exposure to radiofrequency radiation can cause individual cells in the body to become stressed. The longer a cell is stressed, the greater the likelihood it may malfunction. You might think that the term stress implies a manageable state and that it's not a big deal. But let me clarify. Stress weakens the body's tissues. Just as stress can cause a bridge to collapse, stress can cause a bone to fracture, an ulcer to develop, or an organ system to fail. When cells undergo stress, unfortunate things can happen. Membranes which protect the cell and control the cell's internal environment can become damaged, causing the cell to lose its ability to function and put the cell's life at risk. The cell's mitochondria can become damaged and produce less energy and run less efficiently. If one continues to eat the same amount, but his or her cells can't use that food efficiently, they will gain weight and become obese. Proteins in the stressed cell can become damaged and denatured. This may sound esoteric, but consider that many diseases now common in our population, like Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, and amyloidosis, are all associated with protein denaturation. And importantly, when the cell is stressed, its DNA can become damaged, which can lead to mutations and possibly cancer. The impact of malfunctioning cells on one's clinical health status is determined by which cells and organs are damaged. If the thyroid gland is damaged, one will have clinical manifestations from abnormal thyroid function, including increased risk for cardiac arrhythmia. If radiation exposure affects white blood cells, it can cause immune dysfunction, making one more susceptible to disease. If the brain is affected, one may experience confusion, memory loss, ringing in the ears, vertigo, insomnia, and other symptoms. If a man's testicles are exposed, testosterone levels can drop, and sperm can become damaged, lose motility, and experience DNA fragmentation. Yes, there are many, many more examples of health effects associated with exposure to radiofrequency radiation described in the literature, and these conditions are becoming more and more prevalent as technology becomes more pervasive. One final point. I've heard it mentioned that the high frequency band of 5G doesn't or shouldn't penetrate more than a few millimeters into the skin. Whether or not this is true, the thyroid gland is often only a few millimeters deep to the skin surface, and so are the testicles. Interfering with the function of these glands can cause systemic endocrine dysfunction, and in addition, many important cells, including red blood cells and immune cells, are just below the skin surface. Radiation doesn't need to go deep to cause damage. Thank you.
Well, what do you think?